All rise. Veuillez vous lever. The International Criminal Court is now in session. L'audience de la Cour pénale internationale est ouverte. Please be seated. Veuillez vous asseoir.
Bonjour. Je souhaite la bienvenue à toutes les personnes présentes aujourd'hui dans le prétoire ainsi que dans la galerie du public. Madame la greffière d'audience, veuillez appeler l'affaire, je vous prie.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Mesdames, Messieurs les juges, la situation au Mali, affaire le procureur contre Alassane Ag Abdulaziz, Ag Mohamed, Ag Mahmoud. Référence de l'affaire ICC 01 12 01 18. Nous sommes en audience publique.
Merci beaucoup. Au nom de mes collègues, Madame le juge Reine Adelaide Sophie Alapini-Gansou et Monsieur le juge Marc Perrin de Brichambault, je vous souhaite la bienvenue à toutes les parties et participants et au suspect, Monsieur Alassane. Je souhaiterais maintenant inviter les parties et participants à se présenter. Je commencerai par le bureau du procureur. Madame Belsouda, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. President, honorable judges, the Office of the Prosecutor is represented today by Gilles Dutertre, Senior Trial Lawyer, Jaganaden Munisami, Trial Lawyer, Hesham Murad, Trial Lawyer, Diane Looping, Trial Lawyer, Raymond Sandoval, Trial Lawyer, Marie-Claudine Umurungi, Assistant Legal Officer, Sarah Kokio, Assistant Legal Officer, and Sanya Bakulish, Case Manager, and myself, Fatou Bensouda, Prosecutor.
Merci beaucoup, Madame le prosecuteur. Et je me tourne maintenant vers la défense. Madame Taylor, veuillez bien présenter votre équipe, s'il vous plaît.
Good afternoon, Mr. President, Your Honours, and good afternoon to all my colleagues in the courtroom. My name is Melinda Taylor. I am appearing this afternoon on behalf of Mr. Al-Hassan, together with my colleagues, Madame Marilyn Poul, Madame Sarah Marinia Doucet, Mr. Mohamed Youssef, Ms. Dolly Chala, Ms. Marie-Noël Delil, and Ms. Lily Wang. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup. Les représentants légaux des victimes, pourriez-vous présenter, s'il vous plaît?
Monsieur le Président, honorable juge, bonjour. L'équipe de représentants légaux se compose ce matin par Maître Mayombo Kassongo, moi-même Maître Seydou Doumbia. Nous avons à nos côtés Madame Claire Laplace, ainsi que Prisque, Madame Prisque Biyeke Dipanga. Monsieur le Président, nous devrions être avec Maître Fidel Sita, qui malheureusement est empêché cet après-midi pour cause de santé. Il vous dit bonjour. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Maître. Je vais maintenant présenter mes collègues, les juges de la chambre préliminaire numéro 1. Se trouve à ma droite Monsieur le juge Marc Perrin de Brichambault et à ma gauche se trouve Madame la juge Reine Adelaide Sophie Alapini-Gansou. Et en dernier lieu, je me présente, je suis quant à moi Peter Kovac, juge président de cette chambre. J'aimerais maintenant apporter quelques précisions. Et je commencerai par vous parler de la nature de cette audience ainsi que du rôle que cette chambre préliminaire doit jouer. Nous en sommes au stade préliminaire de l'affaire et cette chambre n'a pas à se prononcer sur la culpabilité ou sur l'innocence de M. Alassane. Notre devoir consiste à déterminer s'il existe des preuves suffisantes pour établir des motifs substantiels de croire que M. Alassane a commis les crimes qui lui sont reprochés tels que le dispose l'article 61, paragraphe 7 du statut de Rome. La Chambre souhaiterait également réitérer les principes généraux qui vont orienter cette audience. Premièrement, la présomption d'innocence s'applique conformément à l'article 66 du statut de Rome. Deuxièmement, la charge de la preuve revient au procureur. En conséquence, le procureur devra fournir suffisamment d'éléments de preuve pour prouver les charges présentées contre M. Alassane, conformément à la norme d'administration de la preuve prévue à l'article 61, paragraphe 7 du statut. Troisièmement, la défense bénéficie de l'ensemble des droits garantis par l'article 61, paragraphe 6 et l'article 67 du statut. Finalement, même si la règle générale est que cette audience doit être publique, il se peut, afin de protéger des informations confidentielles, notamment au regard des témoins, que nous soyons obligés de passer en audience à huis clos ou à huis clos partiel. Selon l'ordonnance portant calendrier aux fins de l'audience de confirmation des charges, le procureur dispose de 6 séances d'1 heure et 30 minutes pour présenter ses observations orales. Les représentants légaux des victimes disposent d'une séance d'1 heure et 30 minutes et la défense dispose de 6 séances de 1 heure et 30 minutes. Le temps accordé inclut le temps pour répondre aux questions qui ont été distribuées avant l'audience. Les parties et participants disposeront ensuite de 30 minutes pour présenter leur déclaration finale. Comme indiqué dans l'ordonnance modifiant l'ordonnance portant le calendrier de l'audience de confirmation des charges, ces déclarations finales auront lieu le 17 juillet 2019. J'aimerais ajouter que si l'une ou l'autre des parties et participants n'utilise pas le temps qui lui est accordé dans le calendrier, la présentation d'un exposé peut être avancée même si elle n'était pas prévue lors de la séance en question. Ainsi, les parties et participants doivent être prêts à tout moment et faire preuve de souplesse. J'aimerais également vous rappeler certains aspects techniques pour le bon déroulement de l'audience. Lorsque les parties et participants feront référence à des éléments de preuve, ils devront indiquer le niveau de confidentialité du dit élément de preuve et préciser s'il est nécessaire de passer à huis clos ou à huis clos partiel. La Chambre rappelle également aux parties et participants que lors des audiences publiques, elles ne devront pas utiliser les noms des victimes et des témoins, mais uniquement faire référence à leur code ou pseudonyme. En dernier lieu, j'aimerais rappeler aux parties et participants de ne pas parler trop vite. En effet, j'enjoins aux parties et participants d'attendre 5 secondes après chaque phrase, car il y a une interprétation simultanée de cette audience, notamment vers l'arabe. Conformément à la règle 122 alinéa 1 du règlement de procédure et de preuve, je dois demander à la greffière d'audience de nous donner lecture des charges présentées par le procureur dans son document contenant les charges. Cependant, je me tourne vers M. Alassane. Souhaitez-vous, M. Alassane, que les charges soient lues ou bien estimez-vous avoir parfaitement connaissance des charges qui sont portées contre vous?
أنا على علم بها.
Merci beaucoup. Ceci dit, M. Alassane, j'espère sincèrement que vous avez compris la nature des charges qui sont reprochées par le procureur.
نعم فهمتها.
Je vous en remercie. La Chambre rappelle Qu'en vertu de la règle 122 alinéa 3 du règlement de procédure et de preuve, les parties ont la possibilité de, je cite, soulever des exceptions ou présenter des observations au sujet d'une question touchant à la régularité des procédures qui ont précédé l'audience. La Chambre rappelle également aux parties qu'en vertu de la règle 122 alinéa 4 du règlement de procédure et de preuve, les exceptions qui sont soulevées ou les observations qui sont présentées en application de la disposition de la règle 122 alinéa 3 du règlement de procédure et de preuve ne peuvent plus l'être par la suite, ni lors de la procédure de confirmation, ni lors du procès. Je m'adresse donc aux parties afin qu'elles nous indiquent si elles ont l'intention de soulever des exceptions ou présenter des observations en vertu de la règle 122 alinéa 3 du règlement de procédure et de preuve. Madame la procureure, vous avez la parole.
None, Mr. President.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la procureure. Je demande maintenant à la défense si elle entend soulever des exceptions ou présenter des observations en vertu de la règle 122.3 du règlement de procédure et de preuve. Madame Taylor, vous avez la parole.
Thank you, Mr. President. Yes, we do have the intention of raising 3 issues, and I will be guided by the Chamber as to whether we should raise them now or a later point today.
Maître Taylor, maintenant. Donc la parole est à vous.
Thank you, Mr. President, Your Honours. I will be addressing 3 issues, and my colleague, Maître Poul, will be addressing 1 small issue at the end of my submissions. Mr. President, Your Honours, as stated by Robert H. Jackson, the world yields no respect to courts that are merely organised to convict. And I would suggest that it is equally true that the world yields no respect to legal proceedings which are organised for a predetermined purpose. For example, to confirm the charges against a particular defendant. For this reason, the objective of the confirmation process, which is to filter out evidentially and legally unsound cases, must be given full effect. As explained by Judge Cole in his dissenting opinion in the Ruto confirmation decision, the confirmation of charges can have enormous negative consequences for the charged person, including unnecessary public stigmatization. For the court itself, it can lead to huge expenses and amount to a violation of the necessity to ensure as much as possible judicial economy in the interest of justice. The defense nonetheless has 3 reasons to fear that the filtering purpose of the confirmation proceedings will not be applied effectively in this case. And those 3 reasons are, firstly, the lack of effective judicial supervision as concerns the prosecution's investigations and disclosure in this case. Secondly, the organisation of this confirmation process itself, particularly in light of the 43 questions sent to the parties on Friday evening. And thirdly, the composition of the pre-trial chamber, in particular as concerns the ongoing involvement of Judge Alapini Gansu. As concerns our first ground, to harken back to Judge Call in the same Ruto decision, he discussed the importance of impartial and expeditious investigations during the pre-confirmation phase. Specifically, Judge Call argued that in order to comply with the spirit and objective of both Article 54(1) of the statute and the rights of the defendant set out in Article 67, it's necessary for the prosecution's investigations to cover all factors that might be relevant to the judge's ultimate determination in this case. And that necessarily encompasses both incriminating and exonerating circumstances. And in circumstances where that has not occurred, where there has been a piecemeal or guilt-focused investigation, then according to Judge Call, confirming the charges would be risky, if not irresponsible. If, after the confirmation of charges, it turns out that it would be impossible to gather further evidence to detain the decisive threshold of beyond reasonable doubt, then the case in question may become very difficult or may eventually collapse at trial, with many serious consequences, including for the entire court and the victims who have placed great hopes in this institution. Judge Call's words of caution proved to be extremely prescient as concerns the Kenya cases, which eventually collapsed at trial. And regrettably, the defense would submit that they are equally applicable to the current case. And that is that the prosecutor has conducted its investigations into the events in Timbuktu with its eyes wide shut. And as a result, even if they managed to nudge the case over the line at this particular phase of the case, there is a significant risk that it will collapse at trial due to the unreliable nature of the evidence relied upon. Now, during the substantive part of these hearings, my co-counsel, Ms. Prue, will explain to the bench what you will not hear during these hearings, and that is the absent context concerning crimes committed by the Malian authorities against the Tuaregs, and the desperate situation for the Tuaregs in the north that both preceded and accompanied the events set out in the charges. But for the purposes of today's hearing, I intend to focus specifically on the prosecutor's failure to investigate and disclose exculpatory information under Article 67(2) of the statute. This article is framed broadly to cover information that exculpates the accused or mitigates guilt, but also any evidence that undermines the credibility of prosecution evidence. And that latter category is extremely broad and can cover incentives given to witnesses, criminal convictions, links and contacts between witnesses, or any information that might affect the reliability of evidence. The prosecution commenced its investigations in 2013 and clearly started to target Mr. Al-Hassan in 2017. But over this entire time period, they claim to have identified only 20 items of exculpatory evidence. That means that out of the 20,104 items disclosed in total, the prosecution considers only 20 items demonstrate Mr. Hassan's innocence, mitigate his guilt, or undermine the credibility and reliability of prosecution evidence. There is therefore an appearance that in order to avoid judicial oversight concerning the consequences of non-disclosure, the bulk rule seems to have been replaced by the zero rule, and nothing is considered to be exculpatory. But at the very least, for this particular category as concerns information that undermines or affects the credibility of the prosecution's case, we know that there was exculpatory evidence under the prosecution's very eyes they chose to look away from. And this is amply demonstrated by the record of interviews with Mr. Alassane. And it should be obvious from the public version of the prosecution's document containing the charges, DCC, that the prosecution's case relies heavily on alleged concessions and information provided by Mr. Alassane himself. It starts, for example, at paragraphs 116, 209, 237, and onwards. And in fact, the prosecution relies on his statement in 507 footnotes in the DCC. And for 224 of these footnotes, his statements are the only evidence relied upon to support the allegation in question. So any information concerning the admissibility, the reliability of these statements would clearly fall under Article 67(2) of the statute. And we know that such evidence exists and that it was ignored by the prosecution because Mr. Alassane himself brought it to the prosecution's attention during his very first interview. Specifically, at the time that he was interviewed, he was detained in a location notorious for human rights abuses. Indeed, it was so notorious that in the transcript of later interviews, we can read the persons present describing it as being like Guantanamo Bay, to which the prosecutor investigator replies that in Europe it is the same. They demand the Africans to detain the terrorists, and often, yes, it's exactly like that. It's MLI OTP 0069-1795 at 1797. But in any case, the prosecution didn't need to Google human rights abuses to know that there was a problem, because on the very first day of his interviews, Mr. Alassane told his interviewers that he had been tortured, that he had been threatened with death if he did not adhere to a particular story. Now, given that the ICC prosecutor has an explicit mandate to investigate acts of torture and arbitrary detention, one would have expected the prosecution to explore these allegations in a thorough manner, with a view to identifying crimes under her mandate. But instead, the prosecutor investigators merely changed the topic and continued to interrogate Mr. Alassane about the events in 2012, even though it should have been blatantly clear to any trained investigator that the evidence obtained in such an environment has no evidential value. It would also seem that they decided this location was fertile grounds for potential witnesses who were clearly desperate and vulnerable, and they therefore interviewed other individuals detained in the same location. In sum, even though Article 54(1) obliges the prosecutor to conduct her investigations in a manner that is fully consistent with the rights of suspects, it would appear that in this case, they turned a blind eye to allegations of torture simply because the victim was a suspect. And the situation did not change after Mr. Al-Hassan was arrested and brought to the ICC. At the very first opportunity, his initial appearance, Mr. Al-Hassan instructed his lawyer to inform the chamber that he'd been mistreated during his arrest and detention in Mali. But this complaint fell on deaf ears. Rather than independently investigating the circumstances of Mr. Al-Hassan's detention and treatment, the prosecution merely offered to interview Mr. Al-Hassan again. Hardly a remedy for someone who's already been interviewed by them 19 times. The prosecution then also used his statements to justify the imposition of extremely oppressive detention conditions, which we are not allowed to discuss in public. The prosecution has also impeded defense efforts to investigate these matters in an independent manner. They've denied requests for disclosure as concerns information that is clearly relevant to the admissibility of his statement, or at best, handed out information in a piecemeal and tardy fashion. And this lack of disclosure has been exacerbated by a lack of vigorous judicial oversight. Rule 121, subsection 2, obliges the pretrial chamber to issue decisions on disclosure with a view to ensuring that the prosecution complies with its obligations. Subparagraph B further requires the chamber to convene status conferences with a view to overseeing the disclosure process. The chamber nonetheless declined to issue any such rulings or to convene any status conferences, and as a result, there are still requests for disclosure that are pending before the chamber, even though the confirmation proceedings are starting today. The chamber also disregarded a defense request to convene a status conference to discuss the impact of delays in the proceedings in light of Mr. Al-Hassan's conditions of detention. And that request was filed on the 14th of March, 2019. And this lack of judicial rulings is problematic for two reasons. Firstly, it creates a sense of impunity for the prosecution. They are now aware that they will face no consequences if they do not comply with their disclosure obligations. And this is reflected by their failure to respond to and comply with our disclosure requests. It's also reflected in the repeated manner in which the prosecution has disregarded judicial rulings and deadlines concerning the filing of the charges in this case. And I refer to the exchanges set out in Annex 3 of our Table of Authorities. And secondly, the lack of rulings has delayed defense investigations in preparation. Our applications concerned information that was necessary to conduct further investigations and inquiries. The absence of a ruling means that we are still at a very preliminary stage concerning our investigations and preparations. This results in a very imbalanced process. On the one hand, the prosecution has had a significant amount of time and opportunities to advance its case. But on the other, the defense has barely left the starting block. And if the charges are confirmed, this will continue to have significant implications as concerns the defendant's right to speedy trial proceedings. since fundamental defense preparation has now been shifted to the trial phase. And this brings me to my second point regarding the organization of the confirmation process itself. It took the pretrial chamber 6 working days to determine that the threshold for issuing an arrest warrant was met in this case. But the confirmation process has now lasted for over 15 months. And that is an extraordinarily long time to maintain an uncharged person in detention. The prosecution was also authorized to file a 500-page document containing the charges, which is an extraordinarily long and complicated document to frame the parameters of responsibility in this case. The single judge justified the decision to grant the latter request on the basis that the production of one document would produce greater clarity and provide a clear and exhaustive frame of reference for the specific evidential citations and allegations that will be relevant to the charges and to this hearing. And in setting out the calendar for the hearing, the single judge further emphasized that the oral submissions during the hearing should not constitute a new source of information or argument, but should be a succinct summary of the existing submissions set out in that 500-page document. This clarity, this clear framework has now been jettisoned by virtue of the Chamber's decision to request the prosecution to respond to a list of 43 separate questions communicated last Friday evening. The questions do not concern just legal or procedural issues. Rather, in many cases, it would appear that the Chamber is inviting the prosecutor to expand the scope of its charges and to raise new evidential arguments at the hearing, evidential arguments that will not have been disclosed in advance of the hearing. And the very first questions are emblematic of this approach. For example, the current version of the DCC very clearly states that the civilian administration in Timbuktu chose to leave before the arrival of Ansar Dine. That's paragraph 107. The defense relied on this assertion of fact in preparing for this hearing. But in question 1, the pretrial chamber has now invited the prosecution to change its case, to plead instead that the civilian administration were forced to escape, or that they were fired or otherwise driven out. And on issues of sexual violence, the pretrial chamber has invited the prosecution to supplement its material facts with additional allegations from the legal representative for victims. And this has the effect of transforming the confirmation hearing into a mini trial, but without any of the protections of a trial, or indeed any of the protections that should apply to the confirmation hearing itself. And in this regard, Article 61 and Rule 121 of the rules set out 2 key safeguards which the defense submits have not been respected in this case. Firstly, Rule 121 requires the prosecution to file its charging document at least 30 days before the hearing. If the prosecution wishes to amend the hearing, it can do so no later than 15 days before the hearing. Rule 121, subsection 8, then prohibits the pretrial chamber from taking into account any charges or evidence presented after those deadlines. But as a result of these new questions and issues, the defence is entering this hearing without any clear idea as to what charges might be put in place or the nature, cause, and content of these charges. A further concern arises from the fact that the Chamber's inquiries appear in several cases to have arisen from the observations of the legal representatives for the victims, which were filed last Thursday. Now, the Chamber's reliance on these observations is highly problematic for several reasons, the two key problems being the following. The first key issue concerns the nature of these observations, and that is that they cite the highly prejudicial factual articles that were never disclosed and tendered in this case. The decision on victim participation gives the victims in this case no right to tender evidence, nor should they be given this right at this phase of the proceedings. At this point in time, the defence has received absolutely no information concerning the persons granted victim status. We haven't even received a redacted version of their application form. They are, to all intents and purposes, faceless prosecutors, untrammeled by the duties and obligations of the prosecution. And this lack of prosecutorial obligations and duties is demonstrated by the fact that their filing publicly refers to Mr. Al-Hassan as an accused person at paragraph 50, implying that the charges have already been confirmed. Their allegations therefore constitute a highly unreliable and prejudicial foundation for inviting the prosecution to expand the scope of its charges in this case. The pretrial chamber's reliance on such allegations also contravenes the appeals chamber's ruling that victim participation should take place within the existing scope of the charges, as feigned by the prosecution. And that's decision in the Labunga case 1432 at paragraphs 62 to 65. Now, the second grounds for concern regarding the pretrial chamber's reliance on the victim's observations arises from Judge Alapini Gansu's prior involvement in the Malian Fact-Finding Commission. Specifically, the defence has grounds to believe that Judge Alapini Gansu may have interacted with participating victims and victim intermediaries in this case, and further advised and assisted them in their connection with the formulation of a domestic criminal complaint concerning sexual violence that was filed against Mr. Al-Hassan. Now, the right to an independent and impartial tribunal is a linchpin for justice. To be listened to know that the bench will dispassionately consider and weigh up the arguments presented to them, and then issue a decision based solely on the matters put before them. This right is of the utmost importance to an individual who faces the weight of public opinion and the public forces of the prosecution. For these reasons, Article 41, subsection 2, places a strong obligation on judges to raise any issues that might impact on their ability to judge a particular case in an impartial manner. And this duty is of fundamental importance to the fairness of proceedings, because the parties will not always be well placed to identify potential conflicts. The defence is particularly handicapped as we do not have access to the names of victims and witnesses and intermediaries. And we cannot part the curtain of investigative secrecy to know exactly how the investigations in this case unfolded and who was involved. In line with this obligation, judges routinely bring to the attention of the Presidency any issues that could potentially impact on the appearance of a fair and impartial trial. For example, in the Bashir case, Judge Monaghan, proprio motu, raised her previous involvement in the African Commission of Human Rights in the adoption of a resolution concerning the situation in Sudan. And she raised the extent to which it could create an appearance of partiality as concerns her role as a pretrial judge in the Bashir case. The Presidency rejected her request to recuse herself on the grounds that, firstly, the fact-finding mission did not make findings concerning allegations of genocide, and secondly, Judge Monaghan had not been personally involved in the fact-finding mission. She merely approved a resolution concerning the need for investigations. Now, the Alassane defense has quite clearly indicated that it considers these issues to be of fundamental importance to Mr. Alassane's fair trial rights. We would have expected any judge in a similar situation to Judge Monaghan to raise these issues, to protect the integrity of the proceedings. But that didn't happen. And as a result, the defense has been compelled to dedicate its limited time and resources looking into issues that should have been raised proprio motu in an upfront and transparent manner. And after conducting a very cursory search of these issues, we have identified matters of extreme concern. And the basis for our concern is the following. In 2013, Judge Alapini Gansu was appointed by the African Commission on Human and People's Rights to conduct a fact-finding mission in Mali in relation to the events in 2012. And the document setting out that mandate is number 1 in our table of authorities. The first mission was conducted in June 2013. Judge Alapini Gansu personally directed the mission and the drafting of the report and met with various persons who might be witnesses or participating victims in this case. At a press conference on 7th of June 2013, which took place at the same time as the mission, the delegation informed the Malian public that the goal of the mission was to prove the guilt of the perpetrators of human rights violations and then bring them in front of national courts, or where appropriate, subnational and international courts. And that's set out in the Amnesty International report, which is number 2 of our table of authorities. The mission report, which is number 3 on our list, was issued during the 53rd session of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. And that report made specific findings concerning alleged crimes committed by Ansar Dine, pursuant to the implementation of Sharia law in Timbuktu. For example, paragraph 53 makes the following finding. Still, with regard to the implementation of Sharia, the delegation learned that terrible acts such as stoning, flogging, and amputation were carried out during the period of occupation. According to information gathered, these acts were carried out by armed Islamic groups, in particular Ansar Dine, Majao and Akmi, following a system of summary justice which they established. And this language mirrors the prosecution's allegations in this case. At paragraph 90, the report states that considering the length of the period during which the human rights violations were committed and the number of victims, there is no doubt that there were serious and massive human rights violations. No doubt. That doesn't leave much room for debate at this hearing concerning if and whether such violations took place. At paragraph 91, the report states that rape carried out against women and girls during the crisis are crimes against humanity and should be judged by the International Criminal Court in the absence of action by the Malian government. The question as to whether rape was carried out in a systematic or widespread manner pursuant to an organizational policy, that's a live issue in this case and during this hearing. On the 1st to the 3rd of July, the next month, Judge Alepini Gansu was invited by FADH and Malian Human Rights Associations to lead a workshop on documenting human rights violations and to facilitate information sharing between decision makers and human rights activists. And in her report to the African Commission during the 54th session, that's document number 4 on our list of authorities, Judge Alepini Gansu stated that the link between this training component and the ongoing work of documenting human rights violations in Mali by various actors cannot be overemphasized. At paragraph 19 of the same report, Judge Gansu expresses her view that the Commission's experience in the documenting of human rights through its fact-finding mission in particular must necessarily be shared. Furthermore, as head of the human rights component of the African Union Mission in Mali and the SAL, which engages in monitoring and human rights documentation activities in Mali, it was logical for us to share the experience acquired on the ground. I therefore highlighted the importance of documenting violations in the effort to combat impunity. I also indicated that the objective of this documentation should not be limited to the denunciation of acts, but should be extended to planning effective future activities to deal with cases of violations. At a conference held in October 2013, Judge Alepini Gansu informed the press that the findings concerning violations of human rights and humanitarian law committed in the north of Mali were overwhelming, and that this included instances of illegal detention and violations of fair trial proceedings, which again appear to be linked to the allegations in this case. That's document number 5 in our table of authorities. And we would suggest that there is a very fine line between overwhelming and substantial grounds to believe, which is the threshold to be applied at this hearing. From November 2013 to April 2014, Judge Alepini Gansu then acted as head of the human rights component of the African Union Mission to Mali. That's MISAHEL. And it would appear that in this capacity, Judge Alapini Gansu continued to document evidence concerning crimes allegedly committed in Timbuktu and to liaise with local activists and authorities involved in domestic investigations. And this included meeting directly with victims. Judge Alapini Gansu also explained in her report to the African Commission that her mandate included providing direct assistance to Malian authorities in relation to transitional justice and reconciliation issues. That's document number 4, paragraphs 7 to 10. At a March 2014 press conference, Ms. Sahel further explained that Judge Alapini Gansu's role included meeting detainees who had been arrested in connection with alleged crimes committed in the north and interviewing them as concerns those crimes. That's document 6. The 2014 Ms. Sahel annual report also stated that Ms. Sahel human rights observers actively followed any domestic cases and investigations initiated in connection with alleged crimes committed in 2012. It's document 7. In June 2014, Judge Alapini Gansu further participated in a press conference and a series of workshops in Bamako with human rights lawyers, including FADH and AMDH. The purpose of this workshop was to discuss collaboration between Judge Alapini Gansu's African Union officers and the NGOs in question. And this is document 8, page 6. Now, these NGOs were ultimately responsible for initiating a domestic criminal complaint against Mr. Alassane for allegations of sexual violence. According to a contemporaneous news article, it's document number 9, the 24th of June 2014 press conference was hosted by FIDH and AMDH. And the purpose of that was to discuss the status and evidential difficulties associated with their complaints concerning allegations of sexual violence, in particular the problem that victims would not come forward. On 30th of July 2014, the Ms. Sahel Human Rights Section hosted a conference on information sharing with local NGOs and lawyers. That's document number 10, page 4. During this conference with FADH and NGOs, Ms. Sahel presented its April 2014 fact-finding report, drafted by Judge Gansu, which concerned the documentation of human rights abuses in Mali, including findings concerning crimes allegedly committed by Ansar Dine in Timbuktu. Ms. Sahel further advised the participants concerning the instigation of litigation concerning these violations. In November 2014, Judge Alapini Gansu also participated in a cooperation conference hosted by FADH in Paris. And the purpose was to discuss strategies for bringing perpetrators to account. And that's document 11 and document 8 in our table of authorities. In March 2015, FADH and AMDH filed a complaint against Mr. Alassane in relation to these allegations of sexual violence. This complaint has been relied upon by the prosecution in this case. It was relied upon at paragraph 290 of its application for the arrest warrant. Now, on the grounds of this procedural history, the defence for Mr. Alassane respectfully submits that there are reasonable grounds to conclude that, firstly, Judge Alapini Gansu was previously involved in the proceedings against Mr. Alassane in an investigative and advisory capacity. And secondly, and in the alternative, this prior involvement has impacted on the appearance of impartiality in this case. As concerns the first ground, according to Article 41, subsection 2A, this ground is in itself sufficient to contest the continuing involvement of Judge Alapini Gansu in this case. The article is framed broadly and specifies that a judge shall be disqualified from a case in accordance with this paragraph if, inter alia, that judge has previously been involved in any capacity in that case before the court or in a related criminal case at the national level involving the person being investigated or prosecuted. This prohibition would therefore capture Judge Alapini Gansu's prior involvement in collecting evidence concerning alleged crimes committed by members of Ansar Dine during the time period of the charges in this case, and her role in meeting individuals who are likely to be participating victims and witnesses in this case. It would also capture her role in providing information, advice, and assistance to the NGOs that filed a criminal complaint against Mr. Alassane in connection with the allegations overlapping with his case. And finally, it would capture her role in advising national judicial authorities responsible for conducting domestic proceedings against Mr. Alassane. The role played by Judge Alapini Gansu is clearly distinguishable from the circumstances raised by Judge Monaghan, insofar as Judge Alapini Gansu played a direct and personal role in conducting the fact-finding missions and drafting the factual findings concerning alleged crimes committed by Ansar Dine. Judge Alapini Gansu also expressed a particular opinion concerning whether crimes in this case had been established, including as concerns acts of sexual violence as crimes against humanity. Judge Alapini Gansu also described her role as being directed towards establishing the criminal responsibility of individual perpetrators and assisting efforts to bring the perpetrators to justice. Apart from the broad prohibition set out in Article 41, subsection 2A itself, we also submit that the factual circumstances at play fall foul of the judicial guidelines for impartiality established by the European Court. And I refer in particular to the case of Piersac in Belgium, where the court found that the judge's former involvement in the prosecution services gave rise to an appearance of partiality. And in that case, the role played by the judge within the prosecution division had been to revise submissions, provide legal advice, and discuss the approach adopted in the case in question. And that's paragraph 31 of the European Court's judgment. And that role is clearly analogous to the role played by Judge Alapini Gansu. The second ground concerns the impact on the appearance of partiality of the proceedings, stemming from this prior involvement in the case. And the appearance of impartiality is fundamentally undermined by, firstly, Judge Alapini Gansu's prior statements concerning live issues in this case, and secondly, the link between the matters investigated by Judge Alapini Gansu and the questions formulated by the bench for the parties to address during the confirmation hearing. And in terms of statements, there is an appearance that Judge Alapini Gansu has reached firm legal and factual convictions concerning issues in this case. And that includes the nexus elements for crimes against humanity, which is contested by the defense. It includes the link between sexual violence and the implementation of Sharia law, which is contested by the defense. It includes the link between Sharia law, forced marriage, and rape. And here I refer to the particular language employed by Judge Alapini Gansu, that the evidence against Ansar Deen is overwhelming, that crimes against humanity or rape definitely occurred, that these statements leave no room for an appearance of doubt. A reasonable observer, apprised of these statements, would automatically conclude that the confirmation of charges in this case is a foregone conclusion. The defense are merely whispering to the wind. And the particularly emotive reaction that Judge Alapini Gansu had as concerns her interactions with victims of these alleged crimes also gives rise to an appearance that Judge Alapini Gansu is likely to base her decision on the impressions formulated during these interactions. For example, in her 2013 report, Judge Alapini Gansu wrote that the most striking case is that of a 9th-year student in Timbuktu whose veil fell off while she was doing laundry. The delegation was informed that the girl was taken to the road injunction where people are disgraced to be flogged. If the encounter in question was striking, then it means that the allegations struck a chord with the delegation, that they created an impression that stayed with the delegation, including potentially to the current day. And here, it is the unidentified nature of the victims and witnesses in this case, combined with the very broad scope of victim participation, which aggravates the prejudice to the defense. And that is that because of the particular system for victim participation adopted by the Chamber, the defense has no way of identifying the specific extent to which Judge Alapini Gansu's interacted with victims and witnesses in this case, and the degree of resultant taint. We do, however, know that P570 and P547, both prosecution witnesses, participated in the FIDH complaint. We also know that Maître Seydou Doumbia, who was appointed to represent victims in this case, was one of the lawyers who submitted the complaint to domestic courts. And in his public observations concerning the charges last Thursday, Maître Doumbia raised exactly the same concerns expressed by Judge Alapini Gansu in 2014 concerning the difficulty of obtaining testimony concerning allegations of sexual violence. And he has invited the Chamber to consider that such evidence exists, even if it's not been referred to in application forms. That is, he has invited the Chamber to base its decision on information and evidence that's not in the court record. And we also know that after receiving these observations, the pretrial chamber then decided to request the prosecution to address several points concerning P570 and P47, the victims of the FADH complaint. And these questions appear to have the objective of inviting the prosecution to expand the charges to conform with the suggestions of Maître Doumbia. And the questions formulated by the pretrial chamber, in particular questions 2 to 10, mirror many of the sentiments expressed by Judge Alapini Gansu in her former role as concerns the experience of female victims of sexual violence and forced marriage in Timbuktu. The fact that these questions have now been issued by the chamber as a whole also creates an appearance that the bench as a whole lacks impartiality as concerns the charges in this case. In terms of the remedy requested by the defence, Article 41, paragraph A specifies that a judge may request the presidency to excuse themselves from exercising functions in a particular case. This was the path followed by Judge Monaghan. The Appeals Chamber has also ruled that whenever the statute vests the judges with a particular power, the parties have an implicit right to move the judges to exercise that power. And that's the Appeals Chamber decision on extraordinary review in the DRC situation, paragraph 20. It follows, therefore, that the defence must have an implicit right to move this chamber to consider requesting the presidency to excuse the bench from exercising its functions in this case. Or alternatively, we would request that the confirmation proceedings be temporarily suspended so that we can put the issue before the plenary. Now, the defence has amply demonstrated through the filing of its 100-page brief with 8 detailed annexes that it is ready for this hearing. This is not a delaying tactic. Rather, it's axiomatic. And it should be obvious that such fundamental issues of impartiality must be ruled upon before the substantive component of the hearing can proceed. A criminal process, it's not like a glass of milk. You can't have a trial that's half fair or half not. If the defence is correct and the 43 questions formulated by the bench have in any way been influenced and impacted by Judge Alapini Gansu's prior involvement in the factual foundation of this case, then the confirmation process as a whole would be tainted if it would be allowed to proceed. The replacement of the bench at this juncture would also not in itself create a delay, particularly bearing in mind the limited function and purpose of the confirmation hearing. Article 61, subsection 7 of the statute specifies that the Chamber should reach its decision as to whether to confirm the charges on the matters discussed during the hearing. There's therefore no need for the bench to be appointed prior to the confirmation hearing itself. And in terms of precedent, in the Bemba case, the initial confirmation hearing was conducted before Judge Diarra, Judge Call, and Judge Trentafilova. Judge Diarra's mandate expired at the end of 2008. The presidency therefore appointed Judge Tafusa to replace her, and he was part of the bench that issued the ultimate decision, even though he had not been present during the initial point. We respectfully submit that given the number of judges at the ICC, it should be possible to compose a bench where there's no appearance of issues. Such a step would ensure the integrity of the proceedings and the appearance of justice, which is of equal importance to everyone in this courtroom. And finally, in case there is any suggestion that the defence could and should have raised such issues earlier, my co-counsel, Madame Proulx, will address the bench on a discrete issue which explains why there was no effective defence preparation in this case for almost the entire duration of the pre-confirmation proceedings. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup. Madame Taylor, Madame Proulx, s'il vous plaît.
Messieurs, Madame les juges, merci. Pour faire suite aux arguments de la conseil principale concernant la conduite de la phase préliminaire et le manque de contrôle judiciaire pendant cette phase, nous allons maintenant aborder une question procédurale qui a été soulevée par le bureau du procureur en juillet 2018 et qui concernait la relation entre M. Alassane et son ancien conseil principal. Les 18 écritures échangées sur cette question étant secrètes, nous ne discuterons pas du tout des détails ou du fond de cette affaire, mais uniquement des conséquences importantes que cette affaire a eues sur la préparation de la défense. Car au-delà de ces détails, ce sont les conséquences de l'entêtement du procureur à soulever une question sans lien avec la présente affaire et dans l'objectif apparent d'intervenir et de s'immiscer dans la relation privilégiée entre un avocat et son client qui ont eu une incidence sur le travail de la défense. Ceci va au cœur du droit fondamental du suspect à bénéficier du temps et des facilités nécessaires à la préparation de sa défense. Alors que la défense aurait dû pouvoir se préparer sereinement et sans interférence de la part du bureau du procureur, elle a dû, au contraire, mobiliser ses ressources très limitées pour se défendre contre 6 écritures déposées par le procureur sur une question périphérique, sans aucune incidence pour la présente procédure. Les 6 écritures du procureur portent les numéros 77, 87, 99, 110, 118 et 142. Au total, la défense, de son côté, a dû déposer pas moins de 7 écritures en réponse. Elle porte les numéros 78, 89, 97, 109, 112, 137 et 153. La durée de ce litige s'est étendue sur plus de 6 mois de la phase préliminaire. La Chambre, quant à elle, a émis les décisions numéros 96, 106, 116 et finalement la décision 231 ayant clos le litige à la fin janvier de cette année. Et pendant ce temps, la défense est restée dans le noir quant au statut de son conseil principal, entraînant des conséquences importantes pour sa préparation. Messieurs, Madame les juges, ce litige infructueux aurait pu et aurait dû être évité. D'une part, il semble évident que la première requête du bureau du procureur en juillet 2018 était sans fondement. Il est aussi évident que cette requête constituait une ingérence inacceptable dans la relation avocat-client. La requête initiale aurait dû être rejetée pour ce qu'elle était, c'est-à-dire frivole. Mais d'autre part, si la Chambre avait exercé un contrôle judiciaire approprié, ce litige de 6 mois aurait été considérablement réduit en importance et en temps. L'absence de décision finale pendant plus de 6 mois a forcé la défense à continuer d'utiliser ses ressources pour repousser les tentatives répétées du procureur de perturber le statut du conseil principal. Et au final, la requête initiale du procureur a finalement été déclarée sans objet. Il va sans dire que le temps et les ressources qui ont dû être allouées pour se défendre sur cette question sont perdus et n'ont pas été utilisés pour la préparation de l'affaire. Au moment même où le procureur commençait à divulguer des milliers de pages de preuves et où la défense aurait dû être en mesure de se concentrer sur le fond du dossier. C'est regrettable. Et de notre point de vue, cela a contribué, avec les autres aspects déjà abordés par ma collègue, à la violation des droits fondamentaux du suspect, à disposer du temps et des facilités nécessaires à la préparation de sa défense. À ce stade crucial de la confirmation des charges, la défense est donc gravement préoccupée par l'impartialité et l'équité de la procédure, qui sont pourtant des droits fondamentaux protégés par l'article 67 du statut. C'est conclu mes remarques. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Prou. Madame la procureure, souhaitez-vous répondre?
Mr. President, Your Honors, the defense has made extensive submissions this afternoon, which the prosecution is not ready. It is last-minute submissions, which are definitely we are not ready to respond to now. We do believe that these submissions could have been made in a filing, but unfortunately it hasn't. However, we would still, Mr. President, like to make comments on make submissions on the procedural aspect. And I would like to call on the senior trial lawyer to make those submissions. Thank you, Mr. President.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la procureure. Monsieur Duterte, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Bonjour, Monsieur le Président. Bonjour, Monsieur le Juge. Bonjour, Madame la Juge. Il y a eu beaucoup de choses évoquées et j'avoue que parmi toutes ces choses qui ont été évoquées et soumises à votre appréciation aujourd'hui par la défense, il n'y a pas grand-chose, à mon avis, qui n'était déjà su par la défense il y a fort longtemps. Et donc, tout cela vient comme des requêtes de dernière minute qui, objectivement, derailent le process et le début de cette audience de confirmation des charges. Manifestement, il y a de multiples informations et problèmes qui sont soulevés. La nature de chacun de ces problèmes peut être complexe à examiner. Et pour chacun de ces problèmes, à nouveau, il y a de longues soumissions qui sont faites. Alors il va falloir que tout cela soit mis par écrit et qu'on puisse y répondre de façon utile. On y répondra par écrit, mais d'ores et déjà, quelques remarques générales sur un certain nombre de points qui méritent quelques observations non exhaustives. Et je le prends dans le désordre, l'ensemble de ces observations. Mais en ce qui concerne les propos et les observations concernant Madame la juge Alipini Ganzou, c'est tout simplement une requête pour disqualification. Votre chambre n'est pas le bon forum pour en parler. Excusez-moi. Et je crois que dans ces circonstances, sur ce point important, il va falloir que l'on ajourne sans doute cette procédure et que le transcript de cette audience soit envoyé à la plénière, à l'Assemblée plénière des juges, avec une demande de traitement rapide. Et à ce moment-là, nous ferons nos observations écrites. Maintenant, laissez-moi revenir sur un certain nombre de points abordés par la défense et qui méritent des clarifications, mais nous reviendrons par écrit lorsque la défense aura détaillé tout cela, parce qu'il y a parfois un certain nombre de propos généraux et on ne sait comment y répondre. Concernant nos obligations d'enquêter à charge et à décharge, c'est très précisément ce que l'accusation a fait, sans fermer les yeux, sans occulter tel ou tel aspect, et en communiquant la preuve potentiellement exonératoire ou utile à la préparation de la défense. Nous avons auditionné de nombreux témoins de toutes sortes, de toutes catégories, des victimes, des insiders, de sorte à avoir tous les angles de vue. Pour chaque témoin, nous avons eu une approche, comme on dit, open-ended, et des questions de follow-up pour pouvoir couvrir tous les angles. Il y a du reste un témoin, le témoin 612, qui a été entendu et après des éléments qu'il nous avait communiqués lui-même et qui correspondaient à nos obligations d'enquêter à décharge. D'ailleurs, la défense a ensuite communiqué avec ce témoin sans respecter le protocole de contact avec les témoins tel que décidé par la Chambre. Donc, nous avons fait notre travail et il est inexact de dire, et caricatural, que nous avons eu des œillères. Ce n'est pas du tout le cas. Alors, effectivement, il y a quelques paquets seulement de preuves purement exonératoires. Mais je dois dire qu'on avait demandé à la défense ces lignes potentielles de défense. Nous n'avons pas reçu de réponse sur le fond. Nous avons communiqué énormément de documents en application de la règle 77, des centaines de documents. Et dans ces documents, il y a aussi de la preuve exonératoire potentiellement. Et nous avons communiqué les auditions des témoins qui contiennent aussi toutes sortes d'informations, principalement incriminatoires, mais aussi règle 77, potentiellement exonératoires. C'est à la défense d'apprécier, en fonction de ses lignes de défense, de sa stratégie, de ce qui relève de telle ou telle catégorie. En d'autres termes, nous avons respecté nos obligations au regard de l'article 54 et en termes de disclosure. Concernant les interviews avec le suspect, M. Alassane, je dois dire très clairement, haut et fort, que M. Alassane a été arrêté par les forces de l'opération Serval ou Barkhane et qu'il a été transféré aux autorités maliennes. Nous n'avons absolument rien à voir dans cette arrestation et ce transfert. Nous n'avons rien demandé. Nous avons découvert ça dans les journaux, comme tout à chacun. quant aux allégations sur le traitement qu'il indique avoir subi en détention par les autorités maliennes, également, nous n'avons aucune implication. Ils n'ont jamais rien fait à notre demande et nous n'avons absolument aucune partie prise dans la manière dont il a été traité. Et surtout, je dois dire qu'il n'y a aucun impact sur le fond de son audition. Ses droits ont été scrupuleusement respectés. Droit à un avocat, droit de ne pas s'auto-incriminer. Tout lui a été dit, redit régulièrement. Et on voit que M. Alassane a été à ce point en contrôle qu'il lui arrivait de dire « sur tel sujet, je ne m'exprimerai pas, je ne vais pas m'exprimer parce que ça va m'auto-incriminer ». Preuve en est qu'il savait ce qu'il disait. En réalité, la plupart des choses qu'il a dites au bureau du procureur sont des corroborations d'éléments qu'on lui soumettait, des documents qu'il avait signés, des éléments matériels sur lesquels il apparaissait. Et donc, c'est en grande partie de la corroboration. Un régime de détention et de communication qui a été évoqué par la défense, mais quand le parquet demande telle ou telle restriction, c'est au regard des risques encourus par les témoins et les victimes, en application de l'article 68. In fine, c'est la Chambre qui décide, et nous avons fait donc notre travail et rempli nos obligations par rapport à la protection des témoins. La défense allègue encore qu'on aurait refusé de divulguer des éléments de preuve utiles. Alors effectivement, la défense a fait une demande très générale, on appelle une fishing expedition, en demandant tout un certain nombre de choses. Et il lui revenait, le cas échéant, s'il le souhaitait, de saisir la Chambre. Nous avons fait des mails en réponse, des courriels, passez-moi cet anglicisme. Il revenait à la défense de saisir la Chambre face à des demandes qui étaient d'une grande généralité, mais nous n'avons pas laissé les choses en l'état pour autant. Les dernières communications d'éléments de preuve montrent que nous avons fait du suivi sur ce qui nous paraissait pertinent par rapport à ces demandes. Je ne rentre pas dans le détail, mais la défense comme la Chambre savent de quoi je parle par rapport aux dernières communications et les paquets de disclosure règle 77, notamment 26 et 27. Il y a maintenant, effectivement, soulevé par la défense, cette liste de 43 questions. Je ne sais pas s'il appartient au parquet de sonder les reins et les cœurs et de parler pour la Chambre. Il me semble que les allégations de la défense sont assez spéculatives sur ce point. Il y a des clarifications demandées, mais surtout les charges telles que élaborées par le parquet sur la preuve.
Pardon, Monsieur Duterte,
Oui.
Je dois vous interrompre. Nous sommes arrivés au terme de cette première partie de cette séance. Donc, de confirmation des charges. Souhaitez-vous continuer votre réponse quand nous allons reprendre la séance à 16 heures ou comment vous calculez votre temps?
Écoutez, Monsieur le Président, j'en aurai pour quelques minutes simplement. Je ne vais pas faire durer les choses. J'ai annoncé qu'on ne ferait pas écrit. Je veux être simplement un record sur certains aspects, mais je ne serai pas très long. Je vous remercie.
Continuez, s'il vous plaît.
Ah ben non. Donc les paramètres sont clairs et les preuves, il ne va pas y en avoir des nouvelles qui vont être soumises au gré de questions qui sont posées. Il y a une liste d'éléments de preuves qui a été déposée. Nous avons des charges qui sont précises en termes de nom de victime, en termes de date, en termes de lieu. Il n'y a pas là d'occasion pour le bureau du procureur d'élargir quoi que ce soit. Je pense que je dois être très clair sur cette question. sont des questions pour aider la Chambre auxquelles nous répondrons, à clarifier certains points, mais l'objet n'est pas de rajouter de la preuve ni des charges. Quant aux questions de préjudice soulevées lors de la dernière intervention de Madame Proux, j'avoue que le préjudice n'est pas vraiment détaillé. Il y a une nouvelle équipe de défense qui est en place depuis plus de temps. Il n'y a jamais eu de demande pour demander davantage de temps et pouvoir se préparer. Donc c'est quelque chose encore là qui arrive à la dernière minute. Et je veux dire que on ne voit pas quel est le préjudice effectivement qui a été subi par l'équipe de défense. Je clôt là mes brèves observations, Monsieur le Président, Madame le juge, Monsieur le juge. De manière générale, je soumets qu'il faudra ajourner en transmettant cette question principale de disqualification à la plénière. Et pour le reste, outre les observations écrites que la défense devra faire dans ce cadre et auxquelles nous répondrons, nous attendons également des détails écrits sur tous les autres points soulevés à la dernière minute et qui auraient pu être soulevés bien avant. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Duterte. D'une part, on a terminé la première partie de cette séance et il est à présent nécessaire de suspendre cette séance afin que les juges puissent d'ailleurs se concerter. La séance est maintenant suspendue et on va le reprendre à 4 heures.
All rise. Veuillez vous lever.